Thanks, Amanda. So a quick overview of the current New Zealand economic context and where we sit in the world. So the budget comes around at an interesting time for the New Zealand economy, sort of seeing the official cash rate dropping to some of its lowest levels ever, and inflation sort of just below that 2% target, and as well as employment roughly at maximum levels, which is the aim of the Reserve Bank. Internationally, I think is where a lot of our sort of current concerns come from. We've sort of seen America, sort of who knows what Donald Trump's next tweet will set off. In Australia, they've just had their federal elections, so a bit of a surprise result there. And over in the UK, Brexit, well, who knows if that'll ever get sorted. So, on to the next one. So, if we note the sort of monetary policy committee at the Reserve Bank sort of mentioned that inflation is slightly below target and is sort of below and employment is at the maximum sustainable level. However, given sort of recent weaker domestic spending and sort of population growth declining, we're sort of seeing the spending sort of falling, and given the sort of global headwinds that are coming, they sort of believe that we need the stimulus to meet the objectives that they have. And although GDP isn't the best indicator or measure of a country's success, it's one that people have become conditioned to recognise and know about. And so from a New Zealand context, given that the population, to this end we've seen domestic GDP growth slowing since mid-2008, and the population sort of growth has slowed. So in terms of that, GDP per capita is running about the same as it has in previous years. One of the factors that has impacted this GDP growth is a slowdown in household consumption, and this can be explained by the declining population and increasing house prices. I've just bought one, now I can't afford to do anything else. One of the factors that's impacted, I've covered that one. Looking forward to the next couple of years, there's an uncertainty about what's going to happen around GDP growth. Reserve Bank's reduced its forecasts out to 2022, and this sort of decline in GDP growth is expected to impact employment and inflation in the coming years. So job growth is currently positive, with around 30,000 new jobs being added last year. The unemployment rate sort of has increased slightly, but still remains around about 4%. The economy is not losing jobs. It's just there's more people entering the labour market than jobs being created at present. Investment and construction also been getting a lot of attention with things like house prices and KiwiBuild. So looking at investment in the sort of last decade since the global financial crisis, people buying and creating new things is sort of growing at a positive rate, and our forecast though is that consumer spending likely to be positive but falling towards 2021. Construction sector, well known, struggling to meet demand. Labour and skill shortages have widely been canvassed and sort of show little signs of easing there. And the business model that's currently in place is really stretching firms, and as you can see, we're sort of seeing a number collapse as these cost pressures start to hit them. On the plus side, export performance is strong, with kiwi fruit, wine, apples, forestry, meat sort of contributing to ongoing growth. So most of the risks sort of facing New Zealand at the moment are coming from offshore, and the government accounts are in really good shape to do this and can cushion any downturn from offshore. Government's financial statements for the 9 months to March 2019 were largely in line with the half-yearly updates, with an operating balance of 2.5 billion. So core crown tax revenue, however, was less than forecast, but this was offset by spending being less than forecast. One of these sort of main drivers was the free fees scheme, which sort of was 200 million below budget. There's also reduced expenditure on social assistance benefits. And so net debt currently sits just above 20% of GDP. So the slides I jumped to slightly too early. The risks from offshore. You can sort of see China on the right of the graph there, sort of decreasing annual growth, sort of going from what was quite high, going down to what Reserve Bank, OECD forecast as being about 6%. And sort of the quantitative easing coming out, well, the end of quantitative easing and the end of low interest rates in the UK and the US is sort of putting a little bit of fear into people who sort of don't know what's going to happen after this, so creating a bit of uncertainty. Cool. And then in terms of private confidence in OECD countries, we've seen that sort of starting to fall, which isn't a great sign, as well as the OECD reducing GDP growth. So the USA yield curve. So the yield curve in the past has forecasted almost every recession in the past 50 years, and this has recently become inverted, so people preferring longer-term investments over shorter-term investments. Some downplay the importance of this, but given its sort of history of predicting and the 3 times it did it before 2008, it is a concern for some people. So, looking across at the US, sort of as you would have probably known, the sort of trade beef between the two of them has ramped up recently. And President Trump's just increased 200 billion of tariffs on Chinese imports, and China's announced that it's going to retaliate against those. This is despite OECD advice that says governments should cooperate to reduce risk. Then further in the United States, we've sort of seen increasing tensions with Iran. That's driven up fuel prices recently, which in Auckland you've probably noticed. And who knows what's happening with North Korea. And then also further to this is the Democratic primary starting to ramp up, so we should start to see a frontrunner emerge there. Then UK, Europe and Australia are all facing change. Australia not so much. Slides were done before the election. So sort of seeing in Australia, house prices are slowing. They fell sort of almost double digits in Brisbane, not Brisbane, Melbourne and Sydney, and Hobart was the only place to see increasing house prices. In the UK, Theresa May is facing pressure from her own party to come up with a Brexit result. They've been given until 31st of October to do this. However, that crept up on them like they thought the original deadline wouldn't. And also, Theresa May's pledged to stand down, although the dates of that keep changing. Originally, the G20 summit in Japan was going to be her last event before standing down, but who knows now. Furthering those sort of complications are the EU elections, which start later this week. Current President Jean-Claude Juncker, I probably butchered his name, he said he's going to stand down, so there's going to be a change at the helm in Europe. So yeah, now I'll pass on to Ganesh, who's going to give away the ending to Game of Thrones.